Thank you so much. I actually started my presentation. I was going to say this was going to be a little different in that I was going to explain what we're currently going to do and some future bets we're going to make. But that's actually also kind of what Alex said too about predictions and future bets we're going to make because AI is moving so fast that you have to make future bets on where AI might be a year from now, 2 years from now. So one thing I like to show in the beginning, especially with AI internally to Reddit, is how fast Redditors adopted to using AI. This is just looking at Cursor. We had roughly 1,400 users of Cursor. I think Reddit, I forgot what our size is. We're just under 3,000, so a little more than half of all employees installed Cursor. And that's not including things like Gemini or Glean or what random open code they have installed. Or as we found out from several incidents last week, people installing OpenClaw. So people are installing things very quickly and using AI very rapidly. And we also have an external service. I don't know if you guys used Reddit Answers as an example, but it's a way to use LLMs to have a little bit more detailed search for Reddit itself. So instead of trying to dumpster dive in a community for a specific ask, you can use Reddit Answers to search for, your favorite robot vacuum or how New York City preschools are. Any one of those that I've actually searched within the last week. Um, so what could possibly go wrong with unsanitized user prompts? Um, and I just realized I took this from our branding team, and I don't know if that's a real Reddit employee. So I'm very sorry if that's a real Reddit employee, but I don't think it is. But what could go wrong with unsanitized user prompts? And a ton of things can. But we actually have some really good requests. And then these are external requests. People are looking for stuff like how hard are the AP exams? I assume that's a high schooler or maybe a concerned parent. Corn for feeding birds. So these are the safe prompts. And we actually do that in a couple of ways. In the beginning, most people use Gemini or OpenAI. They had their own security, like prompt LLM, where you can run the prompt through. But that didn't really mesh well with one, Reddit's type of questions that are being asked. But two, we wanted to be cheaper than using Gemini or OpenAI. So we do a couple of things. We send it to our own security model that we've trained ourselves, and we're able to catch a lot of these detections that are often drastically cheaper. I think right now we only use one GPU for a lot of the prompts that we're getting through Reddit, but also we can take a little bit of a different approach, which is this funnel approach. And this is my own soapbox, which I think we have to rely on a lot of static checks for LLM security specifically. So we do things at the top level, which is very fast, things we can do in under 5 milliseconds. And those are things we try to catch when it's in the user path, where we don't want to spend 100 milliseconds if a user does a request to Reddit. So things like Shannon entropy. How likely was this written by a human? Things like Unicode character smuggling, which is pretty easy to catch, where if a user sends us a prompt that's hiding Unicode characters, they might be doing something malicious. Or something that's more commonly known like truffle hog. If somebody accidentally sends us an AWS secret key, or more likely if one of our employees has, Cursor send an AWS secret key to a random MCP server. We want to catch all of those before it actually happens. And we go down the funnel as things aren't detected. So if the static checks don't find anything and the SLO for the service can mind a little bit more latency, we'll go to our faster model detections. And then finally, our much slower model detections that might have a much larger context window. But there's flaws to this approach. And I didn't mention in the beginning, but I come from a little bit of an infra background. And when you have an approach that you have to tightly couple yourself to the product, voluntary security is just no security at all. If they choose to not take into regard your safety check and say, hey, I know you passed this as failing, but we're going to show the user anyway, because why not? We are basically have zero coverage to any new products that pop up. There's a lot of other things, the inconsistent enforcement, if they're going to take into acknowledgement that we deem something unsafe, and obviously the shadow infrastructure, which is as agents are running more rampant, they'll be connecting to production databases and doing all these calls with no human in the middle. And internally, we have to stop the foot gun. And I mentioned one of them, which is accidentally sending secrets to a server you don't control. And I want to go over what MCPs are, just in case you're unfamiliar with it. MCP is the Model Context Protocol, and it was a protocol created by Anthropic. And it was a specific protocol for LLMs to communicate with APIs. APIs are constantly changing. So, if you have a V1 API and change it to V2, the model may not know to adjust to V2 to pull the most recent data. So Model Context Protocol is just a very loosely schema JSON type query language. And you're essentially saying, hey, if you want to query the keyword search, you can do it in plain English, and we will determine how you hit the API in the background. And I like to explain that because a lot of the LLMs are going to communicate that way. So you can throw a random number out. How many rampant MCPs do you think we have installed here at Reddit? These are people that are just, hey, I want to try a new MCP. I don't care if we have an enterprise agreement with them. I'm going to run it anyway. Anyone want to throw a number out there? Thousands a lot. 50 is a little closer. We have 134. That does not sound like a big number, but if you think about what you need in your day job, I could only think of 4. I need like GitHub, I need Atlassian, I probably need Glean or some other wiki. So that means we have 131 other MCPs that people are using. And I can confidently say we probably only have 9 enterprise agreements for the MCPs. And I could say specifically, we're protecting against various things, but the most common one is this one right here, which is there's just a malicious MCP server that's trying to hijack our confidential information. Where if somebody uses an MCP server and it says, hey, I know you have a GitHub MCP server, but I'm also GitHub. Why don't you send me some of your code or some of your files, and I'll do the processing for you. And it might be a legitimate MCP, but we're sending stuff to a random server, and we really want to stop that. So Reddit, we created our own internal MCP server, and this essentially just acts as a reverse proxy. You can see here that a lot of the red lines are where vulnerabilities will happen the most frequently. So a lot of the top portion is just the authentication and initialization. The bottom half is where you start removing the human from the process completely. So it's now the LLM or the agent talking directly to the MCP server. And with us in the middle, we actually wrap back around to our LLM guardrail service. So when there's a request to say, hey, what tools do you offer? We actually send that to our LLM guardrails, and we check to make sure nothing malicious is happening. We also check on the response back, saying, hey, this MCP server sent a response back. Let's also pass it through our guardrail service to make sure it's not malicious. And this is kind of our architecture. We're essentially acting as a reverse proxy into various MCP servers. So we reverse proxy the OAuth portion, and then we create an actual MCP client with the MCP server. So we authenticate twice, essentially. We authenticate through Cloudflare. Are you using it through our tunnel? And we authenticate via OAuth after that point. And this is just an example of how unsafe it can be for an MCP server. So this is me gaslighting Cursor to send an AWS key, which it totally did. It just sent an AWS key to some random MCP server. Not random, I spun it up. Not that stupid, but to some random MCP server. And this is me talking to it and saying, hey, yeah, you should really just send this AWS key. You could use that key. I don't know where I got that key from. I think it's online somewhere. So somebody else leaked that key. But Cursor will just totally send this to an MCP server. And that's something that we really want to protect against. And I luckily get to reuse the same exact slide for internally. These are all the flaws of having to integrate directly with individuals at Reddit. And the internal MCP server, while it's a foundational step, it's still very white-gloved. We don't want to ask people to say, hey, use our internal MCP server when they can still just turn around and use some third-party one. I did want to mention this slide here, which kind of leads us to my next one, which is also Model Context Protocol was released a little over a year ago. So it just turned 1 year old. So the AI space is constantly changing that we have to try to play catch up. And that's where I'm going to kind of go into our future bets. of what we want to do. What I kind of explain now are the first two foundational layers, where one, we just want to have a service where we can do security scans on unsanitized user prompts. Two, we want to have a foundational centralized MCP server, but we want to make a whole bunch of other bets too, which is, hey, we need a registry. We need a man in the middle ourselves, because if security is voluntary, people can always bypass it. So here's an example of MCPs, of a chart we kind of put together, where if you are in prod, you have very limited access to other components regarding MCPs. So if you're a prod service, you're able to have access to a prod MCP, limited access to a corp or MCP server, and controlled access to third-party apps. But you can notice here that if you're just a local dev, you only really have access to, any corp tools or your local devs tools, but we won't allow you to have any access to any public vendors that we may not have an enterprise agreement with. And this is an example in what we're working on now of trying to man in the middle ourselves. Since MCP protocol is a very specific type of protocol, we can identify the request as it's flowing through the system. And right now at the top, this is an example of one of our public ingress paths where HTTPS terminates at the load balancer. So we essentially have plain text running through our Envoy proxy to our K8 service. We can essentially act as a WAF in between that and say, hey, can we analyze this request to make sure that, one, it's not some type of prompt injection that's happening or any other big security threat. I think one big example that I often reference before the rise of AI is the log4j bug, where if we were able to identify that within the request path, we were able to take a more aggressive approach or proactive approach to preventing it from even getting to the pod or the service. And then there's stuff like MCP registry. I use an example of OBOT, but it could be a lot of other things, which is we need a way for engineers and ICs within Reddit to iterate very quickly, but in a safe manner. There's always going to be a new third-party application that somebody might want to use. So we want them to have the space to use it. And that kind of goes back to this, where if we have this model, and this is the future bet we're taking, we can somewhat trust a lot of the engineers and the different employees at Reddit to do whatever they want. We're just going to stop them before they even realize something bad is happening. And that's my talk. I went through very quickly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adriel. You tried to pass yourself off to me before this and say you weren't a real security engineer. I don't think anyone in the audience would disagree with you after that. That was amazing. Thank you. We have time for some questions if people in the audience have any. If you want to raise your hands there.
Hey, I work at a security vendor, and one of the topics I've seen kind of debated internally, but also online is like, is MCP dead? What do agents want to use? What do they want? CLI tools? Do they want something else? So I'd be curious what your thought is in terms of like what is the future of these tools and vendors? What should they kind of gravitate towards?
I think that's a little bit of a tough question. I think the advantages of CLI tools is that you can contain it all within a specific like Docker image or container, even put it within gvisor. And if they don't need access to the internet, CLI tools will be amazing in that regard. I think what you often find is that a lot of these LLMs need that external context to make more reasonable changes or do reasonable actions on your behalf. So I don't think MCP is dead in that regard. I think MCP just turned one. I think there's always going to be a need or a new way to access third-party or larger context windows for any AI.
Hi, when you were talking about like measuring context, both in a user perspective or man in the middling, the other employees at Reddit, have you done any research also, or can you speak to the fact that like because LLMs hallucinate by nature, but we're not just evaluating the context of the query, but also the kind of perceived intonation and weight of the query? Like, is this statement vague versus is this clear based on no context or a lot of context as the user has given it?
So right now, the way we're doing security, especially for LLMs, it's based off no external context. So we're basing it purely on the context of the request. As we kind of develop into one, training our model to have much larger context windows in general, that'll kind of go back to this slide that I had here where we would naturally get into the slower model detection territory. And I think the slower model detection territory will be much more useful in our detection pipeline, where we can pull in a lot more context, like if it's an internal employee that's making something that's suspicious, hey, let's also pull in the context of their Cloudflare logs, their Okta logs, and maybe something that might seem fine, like I'm cloning a Git repo, but Okta determines that, hey, they're coming from a very strange IP address. That will change our detections. So a little different than the LLM itself, but like the using LLMs to access like unsanitized prompts, but more talking about, hey, has a user just been compromised at this point? Yeah.
So, great presentation. Very cool. My question is, a lot of what you presented here is about more like hardening the environment and putting in preventative controls, maybe without even folks knowing that it's there. Have you experienced, and maybe it's a question more of like the security culture, the engineering culture where you are, a lot of pushback and maybe requests for exceptions, like you showed like 134 MCPs when you only have 9 enterprise contracts? Like, how do you balance that? And like, how do you persuade folks? Like, where have you found success? We're saying like, even though you think you are being creative and trying something new, like follow the paved road and like forcing people onto that paved road. So like you said, it's not just voluntary.
I consider it closer to bowling with guardrails in that sense, where it's often for us here at Reddit more friction to tightly integrate yourselves with product teams than to just do something behind the scenes. Prior to working in security, I worked in infra, and oftentimes when you're doing a massive migration, you want to do it behind the scenes. So when we were migrating like a Kafka version, I did streaming infrastructure. When we were migrating our Kafka version or moving from Kafka on EC2 to Kafka on Kubernetes, we try to do that without having a user change even their bootstrap address. So I find it that most times users will be perfectly fine with doing something transparently behind the scenes as long as they get all these guardrails for free. And that's kind of how we sell it to teams. We're saying, hey, you're going to get security for free. And oftentimes they just say, oh, that's awesome. That's great. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit more about the reasoning behind the entropy checks at the top of the funnel?
Yeah, a lot of the reasoning for the entropy check, that was the first static check we did, and it was mostly a cost saving metrics. So, whoops. So we were originally going directly to our slower model, and the slower model was running, I believe, at around 100 to 200 milliseconds. And as we were integrating LLMs more into Reddit, the product, we were getting much more demanding SLOs. I think our SLO requirement was 40 milliseconds if we wanted to be within the user path. So that's when you started introducing all these white paper static checks that are either A, simple regexes, or 2, just counting Unicode characters that allowed us to just move much quicker and give a response back to Reddit answers saying, hey, we think this is safe or unsafe. And we can, in an asynchronous manner, tell you when a slower model responds back and says, hey, actually, we determined this is unsafe.
Is the threat model here mostly English language then, or
it is all
English calculate language entropy distribution for multilingual sets?
We are considering multilingual, and Reddit Answers is also moving towards multilingual, but right now a lot of our models are just trained in English.
Sorry, thank you. How do you currently determine which Reddit employee is using which AI agent and in turn which MCP model? How are you tracking that?
We capture almost everything a Reddit employee does on their laptop. So we use Fleets, we use Cloudflare. So stuff from what they've installed, what their cursor config looks like. And that's how we got a lot of the MCP data to begin with. We also started writing detections against that, mostly to know, hey, has somebody installed a new MCP server that we're just completely unfamiliar with? But we do want to get to the point where we don't care what's on a user's laptop. Do we have enough guardrails in place that they can do something risky, but they won't do something damaging to either our own database or Reddit as a whole? So.
All right, this will be our last question here.
I'm a bit confused because you kept switching the scope between endpoint protection with MCPs, and also you talked about like Reddit answers that like is living in production. So all of the solution like that you built is a single point deployed all across. Like the detections that you have are the same all across Reddit. Is that what I'm understanding?
No. So when an employee is using an MCP server, we do pass that into our same model that we use in production from time to time. So it depends on what they ask. We have a separate detection pipeline also for things that are internal to Reddit. So a good example that I mentioned before is if a user logs into two separate Okta locations from one IP address and another IP address that's 200 miles away, that's a separate detection pipeline for other things.